In Season 2 of the Nested Healing Podcast, From Surviving to Thriving, we will take you with us on our journey to the many nourishing lands of healing. With a new guest for each episode, we will get to embark on each of their healing journeys, with their curiosity being, what challenges did they face, and just how did they manage to come up on the other side. From self-love and acceptance, all the way to dance and movement, we will explore the myriad of healing components shining in each of our guests' stories. How can we relate and apply this to our own lives? How can we brighten our light through a dark tunnel? Stay with us on our beautiful deep dive into healing.
Welcome to the Nested Healing Podcast. I'm here today with Steve. Thanks for being here with us. And
Glad
I'm
to
really
be here.
I'm really looking forward to hearing your story. I'm curious, since you're our guest today, what would be the place you would like to start?
Well, I guess we could start in childhood. What happened, what brought me to this place, but talk a little bit about that.
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay, and so I was raised in a family with generational alcoholism. My mom's a very good historian, and so I know a lot about my extended family. We come from the Midwest, and my parents moved out here in 1961. My dad was just finishing medical school and served his residency out here in Garden Grove, what is now the UCI hospital. So we moved out here. I think my mom was well on her way with her alcoholism. My dad was definitely into some addictive behaviors with nicotine, alcohol to some extent, and I think with his womanizing. And I'm not sure of the extent of that, but he was a young doctor, and so he had a lot of opportunity. So I think my parents, when I came along, were already, both of them adult children of alcoholics, really ill-equipped to be in relationship, and then having 3 kids in medical school, moving out here in 1961. So 1963, my mom had her 4th kid. She recants having really deep postpartum depression. My dad was medicating her with sleeping pills. She was medicating with alcohol. I think she was taking what she considered an overdose of birth control at that time, so hormonal issues hitting too, and a lot going on. So that was when I was 3 years old, and then her drinking escalated as they had more money. So her drinking was somewhat limited by money early on, and then my dad started his practice and started to have money. And so her drinking escalated along with the depression. I think pills that my dad was giving her, sleeping pills, maybe diet pills. And then by the time I was 6, she had had a spiritual experience. She hit bottom, had a spiritual experience in the house I lived in, and was relieved of the compulsion to drink and smoke cigarettes right at the same time.
Wow.
And so that, in my story, you would think, okay, everything got better then. What happened was my mom didn't get treatment. So she had a religious or a spiritual experience that got her dry, but she didn't get into recovery or see a therapist or any of those things. And so whatever she had repressed, which was a lot of rage and grief and feelings of inadequacy, just really came projecting out of her. And so she became more, let's say, awake and active in the house. And so she would be physically abusive at times to not just me, but the other kids in the family. Along with that, my oldest brother was projecting a lot of anger onto us. And so he would engage in what I considered pretty sadistic tortures. One of them being the toy box, which was rather large, which he would set on top of you, and then he would sit on it and laugh while you screamed. He would put us upside down in sleeping bags and hang us upside down. He did some crude form of waterboarding where he would take a pillowcase, put it over our face, and push us under in the bathtub and hold us down. So things like that were happening in the house. Um, so I don't want to paint a horrid picture because one thing that was a saving grace was the neighborhood. And I lived in a small neighborhood in Yorba Linda, California, and so I very quickly stayed out of the house and went to the neighbor's house. And we had some cool hippie neighbors across the street. I think they just smoked weed, but they were into natural foods. There was no screaming, yelling, hitting of the kids, and that's where I went to get nurturing. And so I really made the rounds in that neighborhood and stayed out of the house. And so that was kind of the saving grace. My dad was working, building a practice, but when he was around, he was a nurturing kind of a guy. Again, into his own addictive behaviors with food and cigarettes and some alcohol use, but and what I would consider workaholism, but maybe what was necessary to build his practice. But he was more of the nurturing, caretaking, if you want to call codependent figure in the family. So I don't want to paint it as a bleak, horribly abusive family, but there was enough to create some phobias and some post-traumatic stress injury behaviors from me. That was a lot.
That
that,
was a
that gives
lot,
you kind
yeah.
of a snapshot of how it was. And my
Yeah.
seeking safety and sanctuary in other houses.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all that and some of the context you're bringing in. It's so multifaceted, and I think it's so important to talk about that it's not always black and white. It's all good, all bad. That there can
Mhm.
be both factors, and that intergenerational piece is so important. The generations before and people bringing their trauma through to the next generations through parenting styles, through acting out, through not having had the chance to heal themselves makes an impact, but also the protective factors that there were neighbors where
Mhm.
you could find sanctuary.
I always ask people when they're talking about their traumatic stories if there was an angel in the
Mm,
story. And sometimes it's a grandmother or a teacher or something. Sometimes there's no angel. And that tells me a lot about that person's struggle. If it didn't come from the person it was supposed to, my mom, here at least it came from somewhere, the surrogate mom. And that
yeah.
really, I think, really helped me not completely lose a sense of self because there was love and some love from my mom. It was
Mm,
unpredictable. She was very labile in her moods, so a lot of mood swings. And I believe she still might have been taking pills. And I don't have clear evidence of that. My older brother thinks that she was, but the alcohol and the cigarettes were gone. Out came everything that you could imagine that was repressed.
yeah. I wonder what that was like for you growing up the rest of your childhood. You also mentioned as a sort of very specific demarcation of being six and everything changing. And was there ever some healing or recovering or family type work that happened during your childhood, or was it later in adulthood that you started your healing journey?
Well, this is 1966. 1967, we moved out of that neighborhood, which was a major blow to me, almost like a death of a family or of a parent, because we moved out into more of a country part of Yorba Linda. My dad wanted to get away from people, and so um, I'd already developed some neurotic or phobic symptoms. Um, we moved. That was the final blow that really threw me into a spin. My mom remembers finding suicide notes. So 7.5 or 8, I'm writing suicide notes. I think I'm in a state of grief, um, and maybe some isolation there. So they took me to Chalk Hospital in Orange to a psychiatrist. They didn't do family systems work then. So I was manifesting these symptoms. My mom was scared. She thought I might take myself out. She didn't know what to do. I wasn't, I was phobic. That's how I can describe it. Some really deep, like, fear response. So they took me down there and they diagnosed me as a controlled hyperactive child, whatever that means. Um, so now we would call that ADHD, I would guess. And they put me on a new drug called Ritalin. Yay! And so here comes an amphetamine, more or less, drug, and that really set off, it really amplified a lot of the symptoms. So anxiety, depression, headaches, stomach pain, um, the phobias, not sleeping well. I was super thin. So a lot of side effects to that medication, thrown in with the mix of the traumatic responses or reactions I was having, not a good mix. So those years from 8 till 12, I saw psychiatrists, psychologists. I would say I was the identified problem or the identified patient in the family. They didn't do family therapy. They didn't bring my parents in. They didn't really question, I think, because my dad was a doctor, what's going on in the home, what's the stress in the marriage, what's going on with the affairs or the pills or whatever it was. So I think I felt singled out by the brothers. I remember any behavior I would have, they would say, you need to take your pill. You're crazy, take your pill. And at this point, there was another brother added, so there's 5 brothers in the house, and we're all acting out on each other. And so the oldest, being bullying and the torturous stuff that he did, and then the next oldest, and then me perpetrating that on the little ones. So you just saw, it was just constant kind of chaos and yelling and hitting and not knowing where an attack would come from in the family. So there was a real stressed household, energy wise. And my mom was a screamer. And then my dad was absent a lot of the time working. He was building a hospital in Placentia. So he just kind of ghosted the family a lot. His career was super important to him. Meanwhile, we're going to church together on Sundays, and we present what I call this looks good on paper family. And so I don't know if any of these psychiatrists would think there was an issue with the family, right? But here's a kid struggling now in school. I was put in a GATE program, but I was really struggling in mathematics and languages and things like that because I think I have a little bit of a learning issue. So the psychiatrist, the best one was probably in 1972 when I was 12 in Orange, Dr. Hunter. And they put me in group therapy. And they were doing Gestalt psychodrama work. My mom freaked out when she found out what it was and pulled me from it. So we had Nerf balls, and I remember throwing those at the wall and yelling and, kind of encounter groups. So it was really groundbreaking stuff, but my mom thought it was way far out there and pulled me from that. Still on the Ritalin. And my little brother started on Ritalin. I remember that around that time. A significant thing happened where I got hit by a kid in junior high. I was bullying another kid, and the bigger bully came by and smacked me in the eye and knocked me down. And I went into a full-blown panic about returning to school. And I would get physically sick. And so it was bad enough that my parents put me in a private school for a year, Fairmont Private School. And so I learned how to run, and they kind of enabled that running. And I don't know what else they could have done. I wasn't taught how to defend myself. I didn't feel backed up by the older brother. I was just terrified. And this kid and his friends were menacing me a little bit. So why this is important is because on the school bus of that private school, I met Greg. And Greg came from an alcoholic family on the wrong side of the tracks. And I started to visit that household. And we were allowed to drink there. And they had a keg in the front room that we could steal beer from and stuff like that. And so I quickly gravitated towards this kid and alcohol. I love the effect of alcohol. And I think I had gotten drunk once before when I was 10 at my parents' party. My mom had told me about alcohol, had warned me. Everything she said went right out the window. And so she did her best because she was terrified that I would get the disease, and I definitely did. But I had found something that worked, something that made me fit, something where I could live inside my own skin comfortably when I was high, when I was drunk. And this kid also introduced me to marijuana. So I was about 13 or maybe I'm thinking 14 when that happened. And I began to use a combination of the two. So alcohol and weed whenever I could get it. And quickly by the age of 15, I was daily using and drinking. And so how this ties into the trauma was the medication that was given, the psychologist I was seeing, Dale, at that point, the psychiatrist I'd seen, church, I had gotten baptized in the Christian church right around the same time. None of that worked as well as this medication I found. And so I was really subconsciously seeking some kind of relief. And I got instant relief from the alcohol, and then comboing up with the weed to me was the ultimate high. I really didn't like speed that much. I started trading my Ritalin for weed, and I like that suppressing euphoric effect.
Yeah, and what a juxtaposition to how you described you were in those years of childhood previous to that, very phobic, right? And now that you've found this way of self-medicating, how would you describe yourself at that age?
I found an identity. I didn't fit in with the brains. I didn't fit in with the jocks. I went out for football in my freshman year. My dad was a team doctor for Esperanza High School. My brother was a senior, and he was a varsity football player, a starter. And so I really wanted to measure up. And I went out for football my freshman year. I was 6 foot tall and weighed about 120. And I'd never been trained in football, so I just got pounded. And by my sophomore year, I was not doing well academically. I really struggled with math. In fact, I never did pass algebra ever. And so I was failing in German, I was failing in Spanish, and failing in math. Not playing football, I just sat on the bench. And slowly but surely, this identity of being a stoner, at that time you would be called a stoner, took over, and I started exclusively hanging out with kids that were using and drinking and getting into petty crime and ditching school. And I just really found my identity in that. Grew my hair out real long, and this is 1975, 76. The hippie thing was kind of gone, but it was still really influential with the rock and roll and all of the stuff that was going on. And I found it just really a place that I fit, where I could feel cool, which every adolescent wants to do. So I took on that identity and the behavior that goes along with it. So I would say at that point it was, I'm turning into a little bit of a juvenile delinquent, doing some what you might call antisocial behaviors and things like that, failing, yet I'm finding my salvation in this identity.
Yeah. And then I'm curious too, sort of how does that evolve? So it starts as a salvation, a relief, a self-medication. And does that relief continue, or does that sort of change over time, your
Well, I
relationship?
would say there was a honeymoon stage to it,
Yeah.
where if you would have brought me to a counselor, or when my parents would say something about it, because I did get confronted. I remember them confronting me about weed. They found my weed in my pocket or something. And the first time I said, oh, we're just experimenting, I'm never going to do it again, don't worry. The second time they brought me in, I said, well, you don't understand. God put marijuana on this earth for medicinal purposes, for people like me. And if you would smoke some, you would understand it. I mean, I gave them a big speech and they didn't know what to do with that. And so my mom went to Al-Anon around this time and realized she was enabling me. So she started really pulling back on the enabling, but my dad continued with the enabling, with money, with cars, with looking the other way. He really didn't want a son that was an addict. It didn't show good, you know, the looks good on paper thing. It didn't look good. So nobody could have intervened at that point in a meaningful way. There were some side effects to what I was doing, but they no way, shape, or form overpowered the benefit of the use of the drug and the alcohol and the lifestyle. I mean, it was just such a force that I don't think anything could have been done. That being said, it's a progressive disease. And so I was drinking and using on the daily. By the time I was a junior, I was failing in high school, and they transferred me to El Camino, a continuation school, which was great, 4 hours a day, and you could smoke on campus. And I thought, oh, this is awesome, right? I progressed into, I would say, use of sex. Porn was in there, alcohol, weed, cocaine came into the picture. And so I jumped over a line with weed and I jumped over a line with cocaine because I was never going to do drugs. I jumped over a line with nicotine. I was never going to smoke cigarettes, but a girl I liked smoked. Next thing you know, I'm smoking, and that was a 10-year habit. And so it progressed, and I needed more and more combinations of dopamine releasing behavior to try and get back to the honeymoon stage, right? So I'm kind of chasing the next high, and also engaging in some crime, so stealing and vandalism and things like that. And in 1975-76 in Yorba Linda, on the other side of the tracks, literally, there was a lot of like shooting, drug dealing, beat downs, gang fight, interracial gang fighting going on down there in this neighborhood. And people don't realize, oh, that never happened in Yorba Linda. Well, it did, right? So by my senior year in high school, with the progression, I began to feel shame. I began to feel remorse. I began to put drugs over relationships with girls. I began to really feel the conflict between the values I was raised with, because I was raised with really basic Christian values, and my behavior. And so it started to cause me pain. And so if you think stages of change, I started to go into internal contemplation because of the internal conflict. That didn't stop me. Right now, I'm an addict. It's no longer kid stuff or experimentation. I'm like have to use or I go into withdrawal. And so the cocaine escalated, speed came in, what you would now call methamphetamine, but we just called it speed. Pills. My dad had a pharmacy at home, so some experimentation with opiates and cough syrup and things like that. But mainly weed and alcohol, and then cocaine would be the big three. And as that progressed, it began to really create side effects in really the things I had begun medicating at 13 began to bleed through my attempts at medication. And that's when it tilts the other way with addiction, right? It starts to take instead of give. And but again, that's not going to stop me. So after graduating high school, barely from continuation school, I followed a friend down to Thousand Palms, which is outside of Indio, to become a construction worker. College was not in the cards. And I thought I'm going to go down there and make some money and become a man subconsciously, right? And so I went down there and followed these guys. And some of them were about 8 to 10 years older than me, and they were 8 to 10 years more progressed in their addiction. And I landed in a single wide trailer down there with another drywall hanger. We had a guy living on our sun porch paying us $100 a month that was speedballing heroin and cocaine. We had another guy sleeping on the couch. We were using a lot of speed in the morning to get going, and then drinking and smoking pot throughout the day, and then doing some cocaine in there too. And so that 9 to 10 months accelerated my addiction quite a bit. And we were going without food. We were stealing food. All of our money went to drugs and alcohol. There was car theft happening. There was a lot of felony things happening at this point. And I was away from my parents in the enabling and the coddling of the nice house in Yorba Linda. And I quickly sunk to, I think I weighed 130 pounds, maybe 135. I wasn't eating, so malnutrition. And this is in 1980, 80 or 81. I came home for Christmas and my mom saw me and just started crying. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? And it still touches me. She thought I had cancer,
Hmm.
you know, and I had no clue what I looked like.
Yeah.
At that point, you really stop looking in the mirror, seeing yourself. You avoid that. And I told them it wasn't working out down there and I needed to come home and go to college. And they got all excited. You know, this is what's gonna save me, or that's what they thought would save me. And they really got behind it. So I moved back in there and started clubbing up in this area and partying heavily, cocaine and everything else, but started college at Fullerton College. And I've got a few tickets. So I had a lot of speeding tickets and car infractions, but I got tickets for possession. And I would never take care of any responsibilities. And so my dad would bail me out and pay for warrants and things like that so I wouldn't go to jail. But finally, the Anaheim PD came out and arrested me at my house. And my parents said, what can we, you're going. My mom told me that. If the cops come here, I won't lie for you. And she didn't. So they put me in jail. And this was a huge turning point. I quickly ascertained that I would not do well in prison or jail. And we were up to some felony things that we could have gone to done some time on, state prison type stuff. And man, what a wake up call. And I knew I was an addict. I was almost 21. And so my parents bailed me out and had secured a bed in a rehab. And they said, either you leave, basically be homeless, or you go into this rehab. And so I did. And so going back to what happened with family therapy or that's where family systems by 1981 had become a thing. And I went into a 30-day rehab, had a wonderful, powerful experience there. I was the youngest kid in there. I turned 21. I had my 21st birthday in there. And my family showed up for what they call Family Week. And that was an intensive Gestalt style encounter with 3 other families in this family group and 2 therapists that were well schooled, recovering themselves, but well schooled on Virginia Satir's model of family systems. And so we got it a huge shot in the arm. A lot of the secrets came out. My mom said she was an alcoholic for the first time. We'd never talked about that before. She got the help that she finally needed, and started her recovery at that point. My brothers got to see their roles and their parts in what was happening, and I went from the scapegoat and the black sheep to kind of a gray sheep, and no longer fully in the role of identified patient, identified problem. That was a huge breakthrough for the family as a whole and then individual members. Not that everybody took on recovery, which rarely or never happens that a whole family goes into recovery, but it started my mom that way. And then she became a drug and alcohol counselor. Maybe 2 weeks out of the place, I relapsed. So I went back with the old friends, Greg, and hung out with the people that were doing drugs and preached AA to these people. They didn't like it too much. And within a couple of weeks, I was back at it and back in the fold. And I never drank again, which was a rationalization on my part. Well, I was just going to smoke pot, or I was just going to do cocaine. And so I bargained with myself. And that turned me into a 1.5 year relapse. Probably the best thing that ever could have happened to me. I hit my own bottom. It wasn't jail, it wasn't my parents, it wasn't an ultimatum, it was I could not live like I was living anymore. And I was going to AA meetings high. I was talking in schools about being clean and sober high. I was lying to everybody, and so it really amplified self-hatred, shame. I got suicidal. I was becoming unemployable. And that led to a spiritual experience just much like my mom had had in 1966, where I was sitting in my car getting high and I couldn't take it anymore. I was really suicidal. The drugs weren't working. The pain was totally bleeding through the medication. And I just came to that rock and a hard place, and I prayed to God to help me. And I had maybe a 20-second spiritual experience in my car, like an energy that ran through me. The Holy Spirit, some people might call that, where I was relieved of the compulsion to use. Like it was gone. And then I immediately, when I could, went to an AA meeting the next day and confessed and got really honest in there, and then quickly picked up a sponsor and dropped all my old friends and did what I could have done coming out of the rehab, but I don't think I was convinced. And that 1.5 years convinced me beyond a doubt that this thing was going to kill me. And so that started the recovery path. And so this is when I'm 22. So I'm coming up on 42 years here next month.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing all of that.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. And I kind of wanted to maybe kind of double click on a couple of really important things that
Okay,
you
yeah.
said there. Yeah. Well, first of all, those sort of two really peak experiences that you had. One being that family, family week in your first rehab stay, and the other that sort of spiritual experience in your car.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about how sometimes there's those like peak experiences, but then there's more work afterwards, right? There's more integrating it, acting on it, making different behaviors and choices, seeking external supports, internal sort of
Mm-hmm.
processes around that. And I'm curious, those sort of peak experiences, how did they become part of your healing path? Like, what did you maybe do with those afterwards, either with professionals or peer support or with your family or just introspectively with yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it was a miracle what happened in that car. I didn't make it happen. It wasn't because I was a good guy. Quote, if I got what I deserved, it wouldn't have been that. So this thing happened. The second miracle was to know exactly what I needed to do in early recovery, which was go to AA, get honest, get the sponsor, work the 12 steps. And so I created a base camp. And I was really motivated from fear of ever returning to back where I came from. And then I quickly could see the hope and the chance for being able to have a life without alcohol and drugs because of the intense AA. A meeting a day for 3 years straight. I went every night. I created my friendships there, my social life, my dating life. Everything came out of AA. But really, the intimacy of working through the 12 steps with my sponsor Tex and then my second sponsor Dick Fraley created the father-son dynamic. And I'm not saying my dad didn't give me a lot of good fatherly things, but he couldn't help me like another recovering alcoholic. And so that was so important to create that bond. And the intimacy, meaning they knew me like no one else on this earth knew me. They knew what I thought, what I had done, and that began to drain the shame from my childhood, from my drug and alcohol use, and then the current behaviors I had even in recovery. So it wasn't like I'm an angel and I'm walking on water all of a sudden. I'm still very much a flawed human being walking into AA, and that 12-step technology gave us something to focus on and work together on that started to create a transformation in my character and my core. So it wasn't just like a flash religious thing that happened to me. It was, there's a lot of follow-up work. And the last AA meeting I was in was 2 hours ago. Right, so AA is base camp. Most likely, I could have used therapy, professional therapy then, and maybe even a psychiatrist because I had mental health issues of panic disorder. I had severe depression, suicidal ideation, which I had had since I was 8 years old. All of those things came back. If I hadn't have been in AA, I don't know, if you would have just taken the alcohol and drugs away from me with no follow-up or program or way to recreate myself, I don't know what would have happened. It would have been pretty
Well,
bleak.
I mean, I think maybe from your family history, we know what might have happened.
I would have
That
been
was your
what
mom's
we call a
first.
dry alcoholic.
Yeah, that was your mom's first dry experience before
Yeah, and
recovery,
it was
right?
excruciating for her.
Yeah.
She suffered. She used church and her church faith a lot, but she really could have used that de-shaming process because she felt so ashamed from when she was a child and then her own alcoholism and being a woman, a mother that was an alcoholic, and having my younger brother with some alcohol related complications because she drank and smoked through her pregnancy. So she had a lot of shame and guilt. And so I felt very fortunate to have somewhere to go and people that understood me. And I love drug addicts and alcoholics. That we have a quirky personality, we have a weird sense of humor, and it's just another place where I fit. You know, there's not a lot of you don't have to have a lot of this or that to be an AA member. You just have to be a drunk that wants to get sober. Thank God. So with all the mental health issues, I really struggled. I suffered quite a bit. Suicidal ideation, constantly looking for escape through that fantasy. Um, Behavioral issues, relationship issues, other addictions. So I continue to smoke cigarettes, I use porn. So, I'm sober in AA, but I'm fully in other addictive behaviors. And the reason why I share that is because those might also keep me from doing the deeper work. It's another form of medication, right? And so I might have even used AA as a medication. And I really could have used therapy. I think I went to a therapist around 3 years sober. It was talk therapy. We started getting into the adult child of an alcoholic work. I just don't think I was ready.
Mm.
At this point, I became a tech on a drug and alcohol unit. And so I started getting my drug and alcohol certificate, went back to Fullerton College. This is when I was 25, 26, and started looking for a career and education. And so I was involved in all of that. I
I'm
think,
curious. You said your mom also became a drug and alcohol counselor after
yep,
your first rehab stay. So were you guys going through this around the same time, or
yep.
how
My
did that work
mom
in your
did that
family?
while I was in my relapse. And so she was interning on an adolescent unit. When I was 27, we ended up working on the same unit at St. Joseph's in Orange. We worked together on the same unit. My dad became an addictionologist, which is a physician that's got a certification in addiction. So all three of us would work together and do talks together and things like that. It was really kind of a healing thing. I don't believe my dad ever really got into recovery, but I think he helped a lot of people get into recovery. He was a severely wounded adult child. My dad had severe wounds, trauma stuff happened to him as a kid. But he was a hero child, and the doctor, and so his persona got him through. Um, so finally, you know, um, I guess around 10 years sober, I had a marriage unwinding. I'd met a person in AA. We'd had a kid together. That was not working out. Two adult children trying to have a relationship, two untreated adult children of alcoholics trying to have a relationship. Gasoline and water, whatever, oil and water, um, cats and dogs. Let's put it that way. And I was really violent, raging violent. I quit smoking, and out came everything I was suppressing with that, right? A lot of rage, a lot of grief. I think unresolved grief came out, anxiety. And so I was really mentally not that stable, not healed, and trying to have a relationship and be a father. And by this time, I'm 34, right? And I'm getting a divorce. This was 1994. And I really hit a bottom in quote recovery and severe depression, inner critic, self hatred, failure. I had been laid off from St. Joseph's because the whole crew got laid off. I was unemployed. I was in my first year of my master's program at Chapman. I mean, there was a lot going on there, and then financially just broken. Um, and my family was supportive, but this was the first time I really launched out on my own and took care of myself financially, got my own apartment, and all of these things. And so at 34 years old, I began to individuate, if you want to call it that. But I was really, really suffering and seeking. Um, and antidepressants were offered by my dad. Uh, I went to my sponsor and said, I'm going to take myself out. I don't know what to do. I think I weighed 152 pounds. And I was working as a counselor. And I was dead end in that job as a drug and alcohol counselor. It had come to a dead end for me. So finally, my sponsor said, go to a doctor that's not your dad and not your brother, because my brother was now a physician, and do what they say. Because I was triangulating different doctors. And so I asked a physician that I knew in the rehab where to go, and he sent me to his personal doctor. And 10 minutes into the session, the doctor goes, I'm going to put you on Celexa. I'm going to recommend that. And I said, well, I don't take pills. I'm in AA. He goes, well, then you can just die. He flat out told me that. He goes, you're underweight, you're suicidal, you're not sleeping. And he said, so my suggestion is this, but you do what you want. And I'm like, all right. So I went on Celexa, and I think it helped get me off the floor, because now the depression had turned into a biochemical cycle. I was a real mess, and the divorce and all of the other stuff that I'd been avoiding or not knowing how to handle. At this point, this physician that I worked with at St. Joe's, Dr. Fritz, had done landmark education, otherwise known as the Forum, and in the 70s known as EST training. Mm. And so he came out of it. I saw this man transform from this weekend seminar he did, and I said, where is it? I was out of answers, and so I signed up for the Landmark Forum, and I did about 18 months of heavy work in the landmark education realm. that really opened up a different way of kind of looking at myself, looking at my life, and took me out of the blame and the story. So I had a lot of blame and story about how my parents had wrecked me, and that's why I was 37 and couldn't have a relationship, and I probably never would, and the story. And I really got into taking responsibility. So you could call this narrative therapy of recreating or creating my truth about myself. And so this began a healing of the past, or of the traumas from the past, I would say. A huge, huge kind of a fork in the road for me was this work that I started to do.
Wow. I'm also struck by, something you said a few sentences back, that you'd hit another kind of bottom while sober in AA.
Yeah.
And then, the medication and this other deeper work you did for 18 months. And I guess I'm kind of wondering if you could maybe tease apart sort of what are the different threads of healing happening here, and sort of also maybe sensing into like the readiness for when the next stage came for you, because obviously you couldn't have probably done all of these things at once. First day sober when you were in rehab, but
Yeah,
there's
there's
more
no way.
layers to come. Like sobriety's not the end. There's deeper healing beyond that. There's more
Hmm.
trauma to resolve beyond that, etc. So I'm curious if you could maybe kind of
It's
name that a little more specifically.
it's really interesting. I'm reading a book about Bill Wilson, and Bill Wilson was the founder of AA, and how he went into a deep, deep depression for 11 years. And so he had conquered phase one of recovery, which is getting yourself stabilized after tearing yourself apart with alcohol and drugs. I would call that phase one, developing base camp in program or practice, whatever that is. It could be exercise, meditation, AA, whatever your base camp's going to be, and some stability in job and education and pursuing things like that. And then phase two comes around, and this is where the bottom is for a lot of us in recovery, that a lot of people, it's subconscious and they don't understand it. More and more people are understanding it. This is when you go into Al-Anon, or you go into Adult Children of Alcoholics 12-step work, and you go after the causes and conditions of your addictive self-medicating cycle. And generally it's trauma related for 90% of us. And so Al-Anon takes a deeper inner cut at the 12 steps. And then ACA is the more updated version of the 12 steps that includes trauma related language and trauma related work in the 12 steps. I would say the ACA red book and the ACA yellow book and the Loving Parent Guidebook are the most updated 12-step recovery guides out there. So I had visited that in '86, but it was a fledgling program. And by 2006, they had rewritten their book and their literature. And it's still not as big as I think it should be, but that phase two recovery is going into the deeper issues, right? And not just the surface issue of the drug and alcohol use, which to me is just surfacey, and realizing that more work needed to be done. So I probably 10 years ago, at about 30, 32 years of sobriety, I dove deep. I'd been toying around in Al-Anon, but I dove deep into the ACA 12 steps. Along with that, I started my own EMDR work with my therapist, Donna. And so I was teaching it, and I thought, well, you're full of crap because you've never done it. And so I was really curious about it, and I went in with a list of what I think 20 things that I wanted to focus on in EMDR, and we started doing that work. That to me was very significant. Talk therapy is good. CBT is great, but it will not pull the splinter out of your midbrain of the trauma. So we went into the toy box, we went into the bathtub, We went into getting hit by that kid in junior high. We worked with a part of me that was a coward. We worked with a part of me that was a rager, an almost homicidal rage part of me, what I would call the Jungian shadow, right? We went into some shadow work, into some sexual issues, my divorce, which I'd never processed. So what it did, and I was claustrophobic as hell from what happened with my brother. And so a big relief was, and how I knew EMDR had worked was I could get on an airplane without having a panic attack. And so I didn't forget the trauma, but it took the reaction down and the phobic response down from an 8 or 9 to maybe a 3. And so that's when I knew that was working. And I started becoming a lot easier on myself. The inner critic began to quiet down, and in came some compassion.
Wonderful. And I'm curious too, how did you feel like in your journey, maybe inside of yourself? You're mentioning, so many different healing modalities that you've engaged with at different points. What was that sort of inner experience of knowing when you were ready for the next thing? I kind of am reflecting on, different moments, like even, when you were living out in A Thousand Palms and came home to visit for Christmas and
Mm-hmm.
said, it's not working there. I need to come home, right? Like different moments where you had that realization of like, I need to ask for something here. I need to seek something different. I'm curious how that maybe showed up for you in each of those sort of deepening healing things, because it's I'm thinking of listeners listening to this, and it's so many great resources
Mm-hmm.
and so much to try, and it feels almost like a big buffet. But was there an inner guidance you were listening to along that journey of where to go next?
Yeah, I think, the wisdom in all of this is looking back and seeing how pain, psychic pain, was an ally
Mhm.
and a driver of moving to the unknown, and moving into the fear of the unknown of recovery, moving into the fear of the unknown and going into EMDR sessions. And pain drove it. But now I'm at the point where I'm not driven by pain as much as curiosity, and what other freedoms can be afforded to me, what other wisdom can be afforded that's not driven by crisis or pain. And so there's a shift in how I seek spiritual, to feed my spirit. Let's put it that way, right? But the psychic, or the spiritual bottoms, the dark night of the soul, all of those things terrible to go through, and some of them lasted for years. Um, but looking back, the wisdom is, um, that the pain was the ally, and created that launch into the next phase of growth, right?
I had one other
Oh, go
question.
ahead.
Yeah, I had one other question around the same thing, but a different angle, which is when you're working with others, right? When you have sponsees or clients, or and when you're a drug and alcohol counselor, or as a professor, in any of these contexts, when you're the one that's the professional and someone else is in their journey, what's your sort of sense for readiness there about when it's time for the next deeper level
We're
of
really
recovery?
honoring the person's pain, honoring, quote, depression, seeing underneath the grief, the unresolved grief for most of these things, working with the anxiety, knowing that there's a reason for it, there's a purpose for it, right? And having compassion, and being able to sit with a student, a client, in their pain, and not follow my urge to fix, rescue, or save, or make it better. Really honoring their dignity to feel their process, and understanding, again, pain is the ally. Uncomfortability is the ally, and working with that, and looking into motivational interviewing and stages of change. Yes, I want to guide them to the next stage, and allow them that opening and that opportunity. That's part of my duty or my job there, but I don't want to push them too quickly. As a young counselor, I would dive for the trauma I would go for the tears, the catharsis, and think that was great. And it might have been to some extent, but I think these people were also probably not prepared to go as deep sometimes as I would take them. And so now I might really be more sensitive in honoring what that person can tolerate. Do they have a really strong base camp? Do they have really nothing as far as a daily spiritual practice of meditation or exercise or whatever? They're just doom scrolling their phone, you know, then maybe it would be overwhelming for that person. So I would guess the wisdom is my timing and honoring where that person's coming from. And then just honoring all the subconscious factors, cultural factors, family, history, collective trauma that's happening right now, and just understanding, man, there's a lot going on here. And not making the person wrong for having anxiety attacks or for being resistant to treatment or whatever message I'm trying to give them, and not personalizing it, but saying, okay, well, maybe it's not your time to have this aha moment. Yeah.
It's really helpful. Thanks.
So a few things happened in the last 7 years that were in my top five. One was I was working at Hoag doing family groups before COVID, and I had to get some CEUs for my drug and alcohol cert, and so I went over to another rehab to get some trauma training. And I thought, I know trauma inside and out. Okay, whatever, I'll go get my hours. Here's a young LCSW therapist, and she knew her stuff, and she schooled me. And I went, oh my God, I don't know anything. She recommended The Body Keeps the Score book by Bessel van der Kolk. I read The Body Keeps the Score very quickly, and he introduced internal family systems theory, which is Jungian archetype, shadow work, what they call parts work. That opened up a whole new thing for me personally and then professionally. So I want to shout that out a little bit. Then I started Mindful Self-Compassion 8-week course in Laguna with my teacher, Karen. Karen is a trained meditation teacher and also a trained depth work psychologist. So she's a PhD. She was a social worker first and got her PhD. So I started working under her class, 8-week course, started by Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, who are two professors. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, John Kabat-Zinn, and this is mindful self-compassion. I started doing the deeper work on the inner critic and how I subconsciously talked to myself and treated myself. And I just didn't have awareness of that cycle. It was subconscious. And so I did that course 4 times. And I'm still working under her teaching once a month. I'm going to go down there Friday. That's been a game changer. Along with that Tara Brock, who's another teacher at that level, and her work. I listened to her quite a bit. And so my practice really deepened. And then my ability to work with others really deepened. I softened quite a bit in my approach and how I teach my classes, how I talk to people, how I talk to myself. So that I would put in there is a major factor into finding some, I don't know, grounding, spiritual grounding.
Yeah, that's a lot of depth and softness and compassion to bring in those recent things you mentioned, which might be in contrast to, or maybe compliments, but in contrast to some of the more dramatic or confronting kind of earlier models, right?
Well, really important to understand what are you going to do before, during, and after formal therapy, especially EMDR. You're not going to do EMDR every day. And then how are you going to support yourself when you really get raw from those sessions and go into the trauma work, my suggestion is you have a really strong spiritual practice. In other words, anything that will feed your spirit. 12 step for me, it could be that you're in a group therapy or a support group, church, any kind of practice that is day in, day out, bread and butter practice that's going to sustain you through the heavy lifting. If you don't have that, it could really, you can disintegrate or revert back to old ways of taking care of yourself, of cutting, bulimia, overeating, doom scrolling is a new thing, drugs, alcohol, dating app, cruising, whatever else you can find. It can really throw you into a tailspin if you're not prepared for the work. So I think with the therapists, they need to understand that too, that maybe I'm going to do some talk therapy and CBT and narrative work and solution focused brief therapy work, and then tell the person when you develop this base camp, then we'll go in for the heavy lifting, if that's possible. To follow a client that long nowadays with the way insurance is and payments are and all of that stuff. I'd like to get into the current real quick.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And I'll just share candidly, I still struggle with mental health issues. I still can spiral into a quote depression or sadness or melancholy, things like that. I can still have suicidal ideation. All of those things are still like ghosts that are present with me. There's loneliness, there's aging, there's a lot of different things happening in this phase of life. And so I might be into another quote bottom or another breakthrough coming up. So I still am in pain off and on. I'm more likely to turn to my practice, but that doesn't always fix things. Sometimes I'm sitting with issues that are unresolvable, or I'm unable to see how to resolve it, or there's no resolution. It's just sitting with and tolerating, or sitting with and coming at it with compassion. So it's kind of interesting to think about that, because I think a lot of people that talk about all of these different solutions and breakthroughs, people might think that they're walking on water or are on easy street or something psychologically. And most of the people I know that are at a high level of spiritual practice, if they're really honest, are still struggling. Preachers, priests, ministers, meditation teachers, they're still humans, right? And so the work continues. That's why I said I was just in an AA meeting. I never want to drink again, but we were talking about gratitude this morning, and I needed to write a gratitude list. So I get what I need if I show up. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that. That is a really important piece of any healing or recovery journey, is that there's not a final destination where you're done, right? It's kind of on an ongoing lifelong journey. But it may look or feel different at different points
Mm-hmm.
of the journey.
Different challenges, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. In my meditation group, we've been focusing on death and dying for a year and a half.
Yeah.
And visualizing our deathing process, what we want it to be, how we want to be buried, which is interesting, what we would write about ourselves, how we would want to be remembered, our legacy, things like that. And many of the members are 5 or 10 years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious too, also, if we could bring in the IFS perspective, I wonder if you're willing to talk a little bit about your personal, if you'd like to, your personal sort of relationship to parts and
Yeah,
doing self-leadership, and maybe how bringing that framework or dynamic supports you in being with the pain that's still there.
it's so helpful in de-shaming and depathologizing your anxiety, depression, your people-pleasing, caretaking parts, my persona, which is I call Super Steve, the teacher, the counselor, my shadow, which is my alcoholism, my propensity for escapism, my rage, my sadness, my depression, my suicidal part, I call Sid. All of those things are, and Richard Schwartz is going to say there's no bad parts, and each part has a purpose. I'm also in a men's group that's all clinicians or professors. 9 of us are in this men's group. We meet every other week, but we've done parts work in there. So when a part comes up, I'll name it. I have a big map of myself I made. The boy in the box is in the middle, the traumatized child, and then all the parts that spun off from that. And then all the parts that have spun off from my recovery. So I like the mapping process in there. I like using the visual. And then the access in a non-judgmental, non-shaming way to a behavior that I could name as a part. One's called the little devil. One's called kill off Kyle. I have no tolerance for you hurting me or anything, I'll kill you off, right? And so we have managers, firefighters, and exiles in IFS. And then, having access to backing off the managers and the firefighters, the protectors, and having access to the wounded child, the disowned parts of myself, like the coward. Working on the coward in IFS really dropped a lot of shame around that part of me. There's another part of me that's a rager, that's pretty ferocious. There's another part that's a shaky little cowardly part. And so accepting, it's really integration. If you look at Jungian work, it's integration of the shadow and the persona, and then self-acceptance, So, and I find people really pick up on that language very quickly. They like the idea. I use in my classroom a lot of plushies and puppets and action figures I've collected, and we'll do Gestalt type work, IFS Gestalt combo, play therapy combo work in groups, and it allows us to externalize that part, have some fun with it, name it, and then speak with it. Have that IFS unburdening conversation with the part. And so there's a lot of imagination and creativity involved in that. And then how I approach myself, again, is not with a disorder or a diagnosis, but with more of a name it to tame it kind of an idea.
Yeah, and there's that interrelationship piece too. Like you mentioned, you can externalize it, talk to it, have a conversation with this part. And that also ties in a little bit to the ACA work, right? That that inner reparenting is a bit IFS informed too, that inner child work. I'm curious if you want to say anything about sort of the relationship that you feel like you have as self with one or two of your particular parts.
I would say I have more of an accepting relationship with the shadow parts where I don't hold a burden of shame. I'm able to talk about them. I'm able to engage in them without going into a spiral of just beating the hell out of myself. How could you do this again? And why are you thinking like that again? You should be past this, the inner critic. So the inner critic is more of an ally now than an attacker. And it really, I think that understanding of the inner critic and not wanting to banish a part, realizing that part has a purpose, and if I banished it, I would lose that purpose, but also right-sizing it. So it keeps me sharp if I need to learn something or become more expertise in something, or I need to change the way I'm talking or whatever, it lets me know. So I would say it's more of a healthy kind of a shame than the toxic shame of you're not doing it, no matter what you do, you're not doing it right, it's not enough, you should be doing more. That awful attack that you can get from the inner critic. So that relationship is really softened. And I see the value in that part. Whereas before, I would think we need to do affirmations and get rid of any inner criticism, and that was really short-sighted. So that would be one part. I like the movie Inside Out. I like how the sadness part was accepted. So I'm willing to accept sadness as not being depression, really. I'm willing to accept Sid a suicidal ideation as, wow, I must be in some pain. What's going on here? You know, is this just an old wired synapse in my brain that's haunting me, or is there something going on here that I really don't want to feel? Is there despair? Is there grief to be grieved? And with the aging process, there's a grieving going on with loss of rock climbing, loss of mountain biking, things that I used to do a lot in my 30s, 40s, and 50s are now, you know, I'm going to tear my body up if I try it. So that's interesting. So those two parts are ones I'm working with.
That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Mm-hmm.
I have one other question I'm real curious about.
Sure.
You mentioned base camp and the sort of base camp and practices and this sort of stability at different stages of recovery and how that might change. So I'm curious if you would maybe share what feels like an important part of your base camp now at the stage of recovery you're at, but also if you could maybe name in sequential order through maybe one or two or three
No.
phases how that shifted for you.
Some people have asked me in different groups, well, you know, which thing do I need to do? And I said, and I'll answer everything. How demanding is it? How high maintenance am I? Well, it's just like going to the gym. Okay, so first for me, physically moving is super important. I exercise regularly. I hike now mainly. I go to Joshua Tree. I go to places of beauty and nature in Orange County or the desert or the mountains or Utah as much as possible. I would say that daily, some sort of daily meditation. Right now, I'm going up to a monastery in Trabuco twice a week when it's open and meditating in their what they call shrine room. And then I do a nature walk behind that place. That's really cool. But really, when I get up in the morning, you know, have my cup of tea and then I'm reading a spiritual book or I'm listening to a YouTube guided meditation, loving kindness, mindful self compassion, Buddhist, some kind of Buddhist thing. I'll read, I'll breathe, if I'm going to work that day, I'll think about what's going to happen. So I'll start to formulate that, what's going to happen. At night, I say thank you for keeping me sober. Please help me stay sober tomorrow. I'm in my men's group, going to AA semi-regular, working the ACA workbooks right now with a couple of people. And then being willing to go back into formal therapy if I need to. If something comes up I can't resolve and it looks like it's a splinter, that's what I call them, a splinter in the midbrain, then the EMDR will put me into that trance and hypnotic state where the defense mechanisms can drop and I can access that. That to me I'd be willing to do again. So the daily is all of those things, and then having purpose and meaning and passion in my work is a big deal. And something I may be dependent on or too dependent on because I'm terrified of retirement. And so this is really my focus, my life's work here for a lot of years. And I don't want that being taken away from me, or I don't want to be incapacitated where I can't do it anymore. So, you know, I'm starting this podcast. That's something I could do and do more of. And so having purpose and meaning and then the altruistic rush of helping other people. That's like a drug for me. Seeing the lights come on for somebody or somebody having a breakthrough and being unburdened, that's a big deal. So my students mean the world to me, my work at Cal State, what I'm allowed to and able to do there because we get academic freedom. I'm doing deep work with folks that might be 20 or might be 60, you know, but it's great to be around the younger set. And there's hope in that too, because these kids really want purpose and meaning too. They're looking for it, and they want connection. So how do I connect to myself, and then how can I create more intimate connection with others, right? Yeah, all of that together sustains me to some extent.
Well, Well, it's wonderful. And I'm so glad that you came to join us for this episode. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering if, in closing, you want to maybe share um, something that you are hoping listeners are leaving with today. Maybe what's your takeaway from today?
Yeah, I'm just hoping that you find value and wisdom in your pain, in your traumatic adverse child experiences, things like that that can just seem overwhelming and destructive right now. Maybe even if you're engaged in an addictive behavior right now, I want to give that message of hope. All of these things that happened to me and that I engaged in turned out to be really bars of gold. Were not fun when I was in the middle of them, but working through those and turning towards pain instead of running from it has turned out to give me the wisdom to do my work, and then also to accept that this is the way it is for humans. We're going to suffer. How do I respond to the suffer versus react to it, right? And that's the trick in there. So I'm hoping that you find a way to respond to your pain versus avoiding or reacting or escaping it, and find that courageous part in yourself where you can just turn into, not alone, but with help, into some of these painful memories and issues that might be in your present experience, right? I hope you find some relief there.